My father was a self-proclaimed spiritual warrior, purporting to battle witches, warlocks, and demons in his dreams. Often, if he awakened before defeating whatever supernatural assailant had accosted him or us in the astral plane, he would be in a sullen mood until the next opportunity to address his failure presented itself. On this particular day, he was strangely upbeat. Not because he was happy there was, according to him, something walking wrong in the house, but rather, I suspected anyway, because his spiritual powers had transcended the dream realm. In a roundabout way, this was one of those occasions that men of a certain age, or maybe just of a certain upbringing, fantasize about. The opportunity to defend their family from a home invader, with weapons bought or forged for such an event. As he made the announcement that he would be confronting this ominous presence, there was conviction in his voice and fire in his eyes. This was his moment. Before I go on, though, there are a few things you should know. When we lived on Farouk Drive, 3 things defined our existence. The first was austerity. This was the 1980s. And in Trinidad and Tobago, the ongoing recession meant waves of retrenchment, salary cuts, late pay, and all manner of economic discord. For families like ours, with 6 members and a single breadwinner, things could get especially hard. At the point in time where this story begins, we were at least 3 months behind on rent, and there were days where we literally did not know where the next meal would come from. We could not afford luxuries like color TV, a landline, or Christmas gifts. We didn't have school uniforms for every day of the week, so washing and drying school shirts for reuse on the next day was a normal occurrence. Having a single set of oversized going-out clothes that you would eventually grow into stood alongside patching the holes in your only pair of shoes as just how it was. When we lived on Farouk Drive, we learned how to adapt, how to survive. The second thing that defined our existence during those days was nature. That side of the Churchill-Roosevelt Highway, shall we say, was in the bush, and it was notorious for its aggressive mosquito population. During the rainy season, their numbers would skyrocket, and as they did, my skin in particular would pay a heavy price, bearing the marks of their violence in the form of hyperpigmentation. A different sort of spotting happened along the inner facades of the house, as both me and my sisters sought revenge on our tormentors. The confrontations were brief, leaving only a satisfying smear where there was once an irksome houseguest. As our battles with them continued, it became one of our chores to periodically scrub the walls to remove any remnants. During this year's exceptionally torrential season, the walls got especially spotty. Besides the mosquitoes, there were the slugs and the fig trees outside that would fall, or was it jump, onto your head as you were passing, as well as the persistent Jack Spaniards that we engaged with soap and water and coquille brooms, sprinting away when things didn't go well. There were the shiny zandolis that we'd often see wrestling each other in the yard, or otherwise speeding away when they realized humans were near. Large snails that most often visited after the rains fell, and the bats that lived God knows where, but would appear around dusk and brush your ear as they flew past. The worst of all the creatures we encountered, though, were the crappos. There were some cyclopean specimens on this side of the highway. They terrified me. Their grotesque, miry bodies made my skin crawl. Their almost arrogant nonchalance when they blocked your path in the track was especially annoying. And even if you didn't happen to see them on your way to and from your house, at night you would hear them in chorus with the crickets, an ominous reminder, to 10-year-old me at least, that they were somewhere out there, watching. The third thing that defined our existence was the parlor on the corner. Specifically, going there with my mother, or with Ezra, my eldest sister, to get bread, or loose flour, or sugar, sometimes on trust, because we regularly didn't have the money to pay. Often enough, after greeting the burly shopkeeper, the conversation with Mr. Brown would segue into asking him to do us a favor, because water more than flour, He thought we were good people, polite and quiet, so he obliged us. In those days, community shopkeepers were the last line of defense against austerity. When I went to the shop alone, it was mostly to buy cigarettes and a copy of the Mirror for my father. The old man was addicted to both things, cigarettes for whatever reason or reasons that people are into them, and the Mirror because he loved their investigative journalism. I cannot vouch for or against the integrity of the newspaper. However, I do know that the same people in charge of this publication were also responsible for tabloids that included articles about alien babies, illicit celebrity affairs, Sukiya sightings, and the like. He'd sometimes have me purchase those publications as well. The Mirror, I reckon, might have been more of the same, except in a crime and government conspiracy sprinkled flavor. Whatever the case, my father read it in a non-sardonic way, and somehow reconciled the ideas of the state and its benefactors being a menacing and oppressive force with his work as a police constable, protecting and serving their interests. That's a story for another time, though. As the only son, I was often willingly or unwillingly dragged into my father's shenanigans. This usually meant that he would ask me to do things, and then buff me up when I didn't or couldn't do them to his unstated and unspecified standards. In preparation for the impending skirmish, I was asked to retrieve a discarded climpan and punch ventilation holes all over it. As I struggled to perforate the metal with the ice pick, my father sucked his teeth. "What kind of man you go make?" he asked, as he relieved me of the tin and the tool, handing me a pair of pliers instead. "Go and cut piece of that for me." He pointed me toward the roll of stainless steel wire stationed in a corner of the yard, as he attempted to salvage the job that I had botched. After a brief moment of contemplation, I cut a 4-inch length from the roll. That part was simple enough, if one didn't consider the fact that the material was being pilfered from our absentee landlady. I was just about done when he shouted over to me. "Make sure it long enough, eh? I don't want the handle to be too close to the pan." With this accidental piece of effective communication, I suddenly knew what to do. "Yes, Daddy," I replied, as I stealthily tossed the inadequate length into some nearby razor grass. After another few minutes, the improvised thurible was complete. As he swung it back and forth, testing its durability, I thought of MacGyver, my favorite TV show at the time. I hadn't seen it in ages because the old black and white didn't work anymore. But what we were doing was akin to the titular hero's antics, except with more cursing and significantly less science. After a few more minutes of beta testing, we, or rather he, was ready. We could barely see each other as we converged on the couch. My second oldest sister Tracy to my right, and my younger sister Riley to my left. Ezra and our mother were huddled together on a single chair as my father tracked and backtracked through each room, awkwardly swinging his pot of smoke and fire. Even with the front door open, we struggled to breathe, as the abhorrent smell of soot, garlic, and miscellaneous oils and herbs filled our lungs. The t-shirts tied around our respective faces didn't make it any easier. Despite my mother's frantic reminders about Tracy's asthma and my tendency to develop bronchitis, he forbade us from exiting the house. "It could do all you whatever it want out there. Stay inside," he barked. For what seemed like an eternal 10 minutes, we endured. As the blanket of fog barreled through the door and into the orange light of the setting sun, I wondered if the neighbors would think the house was on fire. Day 2. "It's still in the house," he proclaimed. He would have to adjust his mixture. I have no idea what kind of oil or herbs he added, but that evening, the colliginous blanket also burned the eyes. As I shut my lids to avoid further discomfort, MacGyver ran across my mind once again. Mac would never endorse this kind of silliness. On the bright side, at least we had a temporary reprieve from the mosquitoes. They didn't like the smoke either. Day 3. It still wasn't enough. Frustrated, My father went over by Miss Verna, our next-door neighbor who, due to a strange bit of town and country planning, actually lived on an adjacent street. We'd usually communicate with her over the back wall, and sometimes climb over or walk over to make a phone call. Via phone, my father consulted with his friend Gershwin, a sergeant who also happened to be a reverend. As a man versed in things of a spiritual nature, he would undoubtedly give sound advice. Maybe he would even steer my father away from this questionable course of action. So my mother had hoped, anyway. Instead, my father came through the door, beaming, and that evening's ritual was performed with gospel music blaring in the background. To the sound of Leaning on the Everlasting Arms, played on cassette, the smokeout continued. I prayed that our daily torture would soon be at an end. Day 4. He lay on his side. Any movement away from this position, and the pain he was experiencing was exacerbated. My mother encouraged him to go to the hospital, but he was defiant. For all his demon-slaying machismo, my father, like many Caribbean men, was afraid of going to the doctor. He persisted with self-treatment, drinking Shining Bush and orange peel tea, and rubbing his side with nutmeg oil. But the crippling pain only became worse. As the day lingered on, he had no choice but to go to General. My mother offered to go by Miss Verna to call an ambulance, but he refused. As man, he insisted, he would get there on his own power. This meant he would have to make the half-mile walk out to the highway to catch a taxi or maxi heading into Port of Spain. After that, to save the taxi fare, he'd probably walk to the hospital, another mile or so. He had to conquer this beast by himself. Not even a helping hand from any of us was acceptable. We all stood at the gate, watching as he slowly and gingerly made his way along the narrow track which led to the junction. After 15 minutes of floundering, he disappeared around the corner. At that moment, I felt a sense of despair that I didn't understand until years later. It wasn't just because I had never seen my father so weak. It was that he was utterly defeated. Not only had he managed to harm himself, but he hadn't even rid the house of the demon. "Time to go inside," my mother said, as clouds began accumulating overhead. As we turned toward the front door, I was the first to see it. Standing there, behind the lacy curtain, was a gigantic crapo, the biggest I had ever seen. The blood-curdling cry I let out must have frightened it, because instead of being insouciant, as is their custom, the damn thing dived back into the house. With my father not around, and all 4 of us children only able to contribute screams, confronting the invader became my mother's duty. She did her best with a coquet broom, salt, and some mighty killer spray. After a torpid and tumultuous half-hour, the toad reluctantly made its way outside, disappearing into some bushes. None of us had any idea how it could have entered the house and stayed there without being noticed, or why it didn't want to leave. But all of us knew that maybe, just maybe, this was the something that my father had sensed. As the rain that had threatened earlier finally came down, the partially unsolved mystery remained. That evening, Miss Verna hailed my mother from across the wall. She had a message from him. It was an acute lung infection, and as a precaution, they were keeping him in the hospital for a few days. He would be fine. Day 8. As per my mother's instructions, I had a half-pack of Dumori and a copy of the Mirror waiting for him as he arrived. We didn't tell him about the crapo incident, but as soon as he walked in, he mentioned that the place felt lighter. He didn't notice that we had scrubbed the soot and mosquito marks off the walls. The only thing that mattered was that the malevolent presence was gone. This pleased him greatly. He sat in his favorite chair, and I presented his comfort items to him. As he prepared to open the half-pack, I stared at him questioningly. He hesitated. Another accidental piece of effective communication. "No smoking for me for a while, sonny boy," he said, as he tossed the cigarettes onto the old coffee table. "Because of the infection?" I asked rhetorically. "Yeah," he replied, as he took the newspaper from me and reclined in the chair. "You know what give you that?" I asked as I started removing his shoes from his feet. You smoke from when your mother cooking, he replied jokingly, as he settled down to read.